Welcome to Old School Sundays. This is your host, Odell. Let's get into it. The snow fell sideways over the glass bowl that night, the air sharp with December pain. In the huddle, 11 pairs of eyes locked on Chuck Ealey, calm, cold, unblinking. The quarterback who had never lost a college game was about to make his last throw as a Toledo Rocket, and everyone in that stadium knew what it meant. He'd done everything a quarterback was supposed to do: led, inspired, won, 35 and 0, the kind of record that should have made him a first round draft pick, a legend before he even took an NFL snap. But Chuck Ealey was a black man playing quarterback in 1971 America, and that, more than any stat, defined his destiny. When the phone calls came, they weren't from NFL scouts. They were from men who told him he could switch positions. They were coaches who said the league wasn't ready. They were from a system that saw leadership as something white and running as something black. So Chuck did what they didn't expect. He went north across the border to Canada. And in doing so, he didn't just save his career, he changed football forever. Because if America wasn't ready for a black quarterback, Chuck Ealey was ready for America. Before ESPN, before NIL deals, before highlight reels made college quarterbacks into brands, there was Chuck Ealey, a quiet storm from Portsmouth, Ohio. He wasn't the biggest, he wasn't the loudest, but under center for the University of Toledo, he became the definition of unstoppable. From 1969 to 1971, Ealey went 35 and 0 as a starter, undefeated 3 years straight. He didn't just win, he commanded. When the game was on the line, he never blinked. His passes cut through the wind like steel. His poise under pressure turned teammates into believers and opponents into believers who hated it. But America didn't. Not really. The headlines praised Toledo's miracle team, their discipline, their coaching, rarely their quarterback, rarely him. The word black was always there, even if it wasn't printed. Behind the curtain, recruiters and scouts whispered the same line over and over again: he's good, but can he lead men? That's what they say about every black quarterback in the late 60s. Leadership was white, athleticism was black. Chuck knew it. Every touchdown came with a silent reminder. He was succeeding in a role football had decided wasn't for him. He once told a reporter, "I don't play to prove I belong. I play so you'll have to admit I do." And yet, when the draft came, the silence spoke louder than any compliment. 35 straight wins, and no NFL team called. But Chuck Ealey wasn't the kind of man who waited for permission. If America didn't want him to lead, he'd go somewhere that did. The next chapter of his story wouldn't be played under the bright lights of the NFL, but under the gray skies of a country that saw him for who he was: a champion. The 1972 NFL draft came and went like a bad dream. Round after round, Chuck Ealey sat by the phone, not expecting miracles, but still hoping for decency. He had led one of the greatest college runs in American history. He had beaten every team, silenced every critic, rewritten every stat sheet. But the NFL silence that day was deafening. It wasn't just a snub, it was a message. Behind closed doors, coaches and executives used the same coded language that had kept generations of black quarterbacks off the field. They said he was a great athlete, but not quite a pro quarterback. They said his mechanics were unorthodox. They said he could transition to defensive back. Those phrases, polite, measured, and still familiar, were nothing more than racial camouflage for what they really meant. We don't want a black man running our huddle. In 1972, America was still uncomfortable with the idea of a black leader, not just in the White House or the boardroom, but in the pocket. To them, quarterback wasn't a position, it was an identity, one guarded by stereotypes and reinforced by fear. Sports Illustrated once wrote that teams weren't ready for a player like Ealey, but readiness had nothing to do with it. The NFL had already proven it was fine with black excellence as long as it came from running backs and receivers, as long as it stayed silent. Chuck refused to be silent. When the scouts told him to switch positions, he said no. When teams told him to wait for next year, he said there wouldn't be one. So he did something radical. He went north to a league that didn't see his skin before his stats, to a field that still believed the best man should lead, no matter where he came from. And in Canada, Chuck Ealey would finally be allowed to do the one thing America wouldn't let him: play quarterback. The morning Chuck Ealey left for Canada, the air in Ohio felt heavy, part goodbye, part quiet defiance. He packed one small bag, kissed his daughter, and boarded a bus with no certainty, no guarantees, and no apologies. To the NFL, he was invisible. To the Canadian Football League, he was exactly what they'd been waiting for: a winner. When he stepped off that bus in Hamilton, Ontario, everything felt different. No one questioned if he could lead. No one asked if he'd ever consider switching positions. They handed him a playbook in a uniform, and for the first time, the only thing that mattered was whether he could play. And he did. In his rookie year with the Hamilton Tiger Cats, Chuck Ealey did what he'd always done: win. He led his team to a Grey Cup championship in 1972. Rookie of the Year, champion, all while still being that same unassuming leader from Toledo. No ego, no theatrics, just results. But make no mistake, this wasn't some fairy tale about escape. It was an indictment. The NFL had called him unfit to lead. Canada called him champion. In stadiums filled with maple flags instead of stars and stripes, Chuck found something he never got in the country of his birth: respect. The stands didn't chant about race, they cheered for the man under center. And yet, every touchdown, every post game handshake, every championship ring came with a quiet ache: the knowledge that he had to leave home just to be seen. America's loss had become Canada's crown jewel. One sports writer said it best that winter: Chuck Ealey didn't run from racism, he ran through it, straight into the end zone. But success came with a price. As the headlines in Canada grew louder, the silence from the NFL grew deeper. And behind that silence was something uglier than rejection: denial. By 1973, Chuck Ealey had become a household name, just not in the house that built him. Canadian newspapers called him the poised genius under center. His photo was splashed across the front pages from Hamilton to Vancouver. The Tiger Cats had a champion, a new icon, and a new kind of quarterback. But south of the border, the NFL acted as if Chuck Ealey had vanished. No highlights, no interviews, no mention of his Grey Cup victory. Not a single scouting report acknowledging his brilliance. It was as if the most successful rookie quarterback in North America had never existed. And that was the point. To the NFL, Chuck Ealey wasn't just a quarterback who went north. He was a threat to the lie that the league had built its identity around: the idea that black men weren't ready to lead, the notion that intellect, command, and poise under pressure were exclusive to white players. If Ely's story broke through, if America saw what he was doing in Canada, the facade would collapse. So they buried it. They wrote history as if it skipped from Marlon Briscoe in 1968 to Warren Moon a decade later. They erased the bridge between those two men, a bridge built on Ely's arm, courage, and refusal to conform. Behind closed doors, NFL owners and executives rationalized it with the same empty words: different league, different rules, not the same competition. But the truth was simple: Chuck Ealey's success was inconvenient. It exposed the system's prejudice in real time. Ealey once said, "All I ever wanted was to be judged by what I did on the field." But the NFL didn't want to look at the field. It wanted to protect the illusion that leadership in football had a color. In Canada, he was celebrated. In America, he was forgotten. But history has a funny way of catching up. And soon, cracks in the wall of silence would begin to form. By the late 1970s, the NFL couldn't ignore the truth anymore, not entirely. Chuck Ealey's story had made its way back across the border, carried not by press releases or broadcast, but by whispers among players who knew what he'd done. Warren Moon knew, Doug Williams knew. They studied his tape, they studied his courage. They saw what the league had refused to see: that a black quarterback could lead, think, and win at the highest level. Ely's impact didn't explode like a revolution. It spread like erosion: quiet, steady, unstoppable. He had become living proof that the stereotypes the NFL clung to were lies. Every time Moon threw a touchdown in Edmonton or Williams hoisted the Lombardi Trophy years later, Ealey's shadow was there. The bridge he built was invisible, but it held the weight of every quarterback who came after him. The irony? The same league that rejected him would later celebrate the very thing it once feared. They call it progress. They'd make documentaries about the first black quarterback to win a Super Bowl. But for the ones who knew the real story, that title already belonged to a man in Hamilton who did it years earlier, quietly, defiantly, and with grace. In Canada, Chuck Ealey was never a symbol of protest, he was a symbol of proof. Proof that greatness doesn't need permission, proof that excellence can bloom anywhere it's allowed sunlight. And though the NFL pretended not to hear him, history did. The cracks in the wall of silence were growing wider, and through them, you could finally see the truth the league had tried to hide. Time has a way of rewriting what it once refused to acknowledge. In the decades since Chuck Ealey's final snap, the NFL has crowned dozens of black quarterbacks, from Doug Williams to Patrick Mahomes, and patted itself on the back for its progress. But the truth is, those victories rest on a foundation built by a man who had to leave home just to prove he could lead. Ealey's name doesn't hang in NFL history halls or show up in highlight packages, but his fingerprints are everywhere. He shattered the myth that leadership had a color. He exposed the quiet hypocrisy of a league that claimed to be about the best, but only on its terms. And without saying a word, he forced a question the NFL still can't comfortably answer. Why did it take another country to see what America refused to believe? Today, when a young black quarterback stands at the podium after a big win, the cameras roll and the microphones crowd in. But somewhere behind that celebration is Chuck Ealey's shadow, the man who proved that dignity can outlast denial. His legacy isn't loud, it doesn't need to be, because history already made enough noise trying to ignore him. The field is quiet now. The wind cuts low across the empty grass, whistling through goalposts that once framed a forgotten fight. Somewhere in that silence, Chuck Ealey's ghost still laces his cleats, still scans the field, still waits for a world ready to listen. He never made the NFL highlight reels. He never got the headlines, the parades, or the Hall of Fame calls, but he didn't need them because history doesn't always live where cameras point. Sometimes it lives in the courage of a man who walked away from rejection and built his own kingdom. Chuck Ealey didn't just win games, he won freedom, the right to lead without permission, to prove that greatness doesn't need validation from the people who refuse to see it. And though the league turned its back, time didn't. Every black quarterback standing tall in today's NFL is running on the trail he carved through ice and indifference. The lights fade, the echoes remain. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you like the video and subscribe. On the next video about Chuck Ealey, I'll be diving into his college career to highlight some of the best performances and broken records that still stand to this day.